Okay, good morning, everybody. Hayom Yom Chamishi, it's Thursday. And Tazayin Menachem. Yesterday was Chamisha B'Yov. That's what I had a Fabrengen last night on what are they called? Zoom. Some guy organized Fabreng. Had like 96 different computers on, which is very nice. Some familiar faces, some young faces, some old faces, some men, some women. Chamisha B'Yov is a big Yom Tov. And the truth is, not just in Chabad, but B'Klal, in the Welt. Part of what makes Chamisha B'Yov such a big Yom Tov is that it comes so soon on the heels of Tisha B'Av. We hate the 3 weeks. We hate the 9 days. We really want them to be transformed. Pass, go away, go away. You don't want, every second of the 9 days is a burden, and the moment they're gone, you say, Aribir, the difficult days, and right away you start going towards Elul and towards Rosh Hashanah, towards Yemei Arachim V'Aslichis, towards more varme, freilich, positive times and days and circumstances. So I should say a word about Chamisha B'Yov, a word that one of the many ideas of Chamisha B'Yov. Last night I gave a whole class. I brought the Gemara. I've done it here a few times as well. The Mishnah says of Chamisha B'Yov that it was a Yom Tov equal to Yom Kippur. Why? Because we're day for Shidduchim. Right? Shebehem b'nei Yisrael Yetzim b'klalav and she'ulin u'macheles b'kramim. And everybody tries to attract a bocher with their maile, mishpacha and other things. And of course, the Mishnah finishes by saying the pasuk that he brings two psukim, a number of psukim over there, right? Shaker hachein veheval hayefi isha yiras Hashem. He says, they bring different psukim, and then it says, "Tzenu renu b'nois tzion." Ba'atara sha'atra li'imei. Tzenu renu b'nei tzion. Lamela b'mela shleimei. Ba'atara sha'atra li'imei. B'yem chasanasa b'yem simchas libei. And the Mishnah finishes, b'yem chasanasa zeh matan teira. Or b'yem simchas libei zeh binyan beis hamikdash. She'yibana b'mheira b'yemenu amen. That's how Masechta Tainis finishes. So, of course, the Mishnah, the end of Masechta Tainis says, and the happiest day of the year, Yom Tevim HaGdolim B'Yosef Yisrael, was Yom Kippur and Chamisha B'Yov, because it was a Yom of Shidduchim. Now, first of all, you have to understand, Masechta Tainis doesn't talk about Simcha. Masechta Tainis talks Kishmoi Kain, who talks about fasts. Most of the Masechta talks about fasts that have to do with rain. If there's no rain, if there's no rain, they fasted in Eretz Yisrael. Some of the Masechta talks about all kinds of other reasons for fasts, called tzara shalei tavei ala tzibur. When the community gets different tzaras, ala goyvay, ala all kinds of things that the Mishnah lists, and they will be against the Tainis. The last Pedic Chamishim, Masechta Tainis, talks about what we call the Dalet Seimis, the 4 fasts connected to the Churban. Just the last Pedic. It talks about Asara B'Tevis, and it talks about Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, and it talks about Tisha B'Yov, and it talks about Tzem Gedalia. And that's the whole Pedic, Merveniker. The last Mishnah is about Chamisha B'Yov. The last Mishnah about Chamisha. What's the connection? The whole Masechta is about fasts of different types. The last Pedic is about the tiny Yos Tzibur, the collective fast, the communal fast, which we fast for Divas Hapim Koyach, L'Richasam V'Shonim Tevis, V'Chol Shana V'Shona. How do you end up with Chamisha B'Yov? So of course the Avi is Teret. So this is one of those cases where the Nister is Yesed Ala Nigle. You must have Chassidus for this. You must. The reason the Mishnah Masechta Tainis finishes with Chamisha B'Yov, so of course Abal Nigle will tell you because you want to be Messiah B'Teiv. You want to finish the Masechta on a good note. You don't want to finish with the 5 reasons you fast Tainis Shiva B'Tammuz, and the 5 reasons you fast on Tisha B'Yov, and so on and so forth. So you finish with Simcha. But why this simcha? And of course the teretz is because Chamisha Asar B'Av comes right after Tisha B'Av. It's the Rebbe says it's the Yerida Tzerech Aliyah. Since Tisha B'Av is the biggest Yerida, the Maimed that they gave out this past Shabbos, therefore Chamisha Asar B'Av is the biggest Aliyah. Since Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is since Tisha B'Av is the biggest Yerida, so Chamisha Asar is the biggest Aliyah. But it's connected to Chasana. Why is it connected to Chasana? So the teretz is because the ultimate Chasana is the Chasana of Yidden and the Meibishter. And B'yayim Chasanosim is there Simchas Liv. It doesn't mean a regular Chasana and a Kala making a Shidduch. It means Kvayachol Knesses Yisrael and Kutchabrichu, Shechina and Kutchabrichu, Yidden and the Eibishter are making a Shidduch. And of course it followed after Tisha B'Av. Why did it follow Tisha B'Av? Because the Ein of Tisha B'Av has to do with Soim, has to do with fasts, about a disenfranchisement, a distancing between Yidden and the Eibishter. That the relationship between Yerushalayim and the Eibishter is like an almona, not almona, ke almona. What's the difference in almona? Almona means chas v'shalom she loses her husband. Ke almona means her husband is alive but he's abandoned her. So Chamisha Asar B'Av is the renewal of the nuptials. You understand? After you have ke almona, then it comes Chamisha Asar B'Av and you have the renewal of the marriage between Yidden and the Meibishter, and that's the reason Masechta Tainis ends with this Mishnah, and that's why such an incredible simcha. It's the simcha of the rejoining, so to speak, of Yidden and the Eibishter after there'd been a certain separation. And of course, the vart is that, like you have in the Nigel that Rebbe used to bring all the time, that shtar sheyatzal of Yidder, v'niskayim b'cheismav. It's einach ha'maisa bezdin klum. You wrote a shtar, a legal document, and people question the veracity of the shtar based on the credibility of the Eidim, of the witnesses. So they made an Irur. They made a Irur. They brought a complaint against the legitimacy of the shtar. I don't know what the correct legal term is. And they validated the shtar in Bezdin. They testified that there's various different ways how it's accomplished, but they were able to determine that it's a kosher shtar with kosher Eidim. So the fact that first it was an Irur, and then it was Niskayim makes it stronger than if there hadn't been an Irur. And since there was a Tisha B'Av, and after Tisha B'Av there's a Chamisha Asar B'Av, the Chamisha Asar B'Av validates the marriage of Yidden and the Meibishter even stronger than it was before. I'll just mention one more little thing and then I'll get to the Igros Kiddush, that I saw a film from Jem, where a Yid was in France during the war. The Rebbe ran away from Paris right before Shavuos in 1940, and he stayed in France over a year. From Shavuos 1940 to Chav Chasiv, it's a calendar, it's approximately an exact year. And the Rebbe went to the south of France. He was in Marseille and he was in Nice. He had a hard time getting a visa. It's a whole story, which is written up. You can read about it in a kuntis, Chav Chasiv in Tafshin Nun Aleph, which was 50 years since the Rebbe arrived. They gave out a kuntis with a brief history of the Rebbe's movements. This younger man lived, I think, in Nice. And there were a few Bachrim, Yeshiva Bachrim. Now, of course, the yeshivas were closed. They would meet every day to learn. Like Beimed, they would meet at night. Upon by day, it was dangerous. Like Beimed, they met, and they decided that instead of learning, they're going to have a shtickl fabrenk. And a strange man walked in, an unknown man walked in, and he saw them sitting there, and he said hello, and he asked them what they were learning. I think they told him they were learning Masechta Ksubas. I have met they were learning Masechta Kedushin, but it's the beginning of Masechta Ksubas. So he sat down to Fabreng with them, like Beimed, and he began to explain the Mishnah. That the Mishnah of Masechta Ksubas begins, Besula Nisas L'Yema Reviyas. A Besula, a girl who was never married, gets married on Wednesday. Why? Because the Batei Din were open Mondays and Thursdays, so it'll be Shailas. An Almona gets married on Thursday. And the Rebbe said, this strange man was our Rebbe, said that a grusha, a machzir grushas, a person who was married to a certain woman and divorces her, if he marries her again, they get married on Friday. Because a regular chasna and kal have a week, sheva brachas. An almana is just 3 days till Shabbos. And a grusha, your machzir grushas, only 1 day. And the Rebbe teaches, Besula Nesas L'Yem Revi, when Yidden were in the Madrega of a Psula, Mashiach would have come in the Elef Harvi, in the 4th millennium. But he didn't come. And we went into Golus. And then came the Chamisha, the Elef Chamish, the 5th millennium, which is like an Almona. Almona means that a husband abandons his wife and he rejoins. So there's no get, but there's a distancing and then there's a renewal of the connection. This is what it would be if Mashiach had come B'Alav HaChamishi. And Mashiach hasn't still come. So now we're holding deep in the Elef HaShishi. So we're from Amachsek Rishasi. The Eibusher takes us back. And he said that this person, he'd never seen this person before. This was the Rebbe. That when the Rebbe would cry, when he would get emotional, so he would cough to cover the fact that he was crying. So the Rebbe started to cough. He was later a Lubavitcher Chassid, but this was the story that he repeated. And that's L'hoyom Tevim L'Yisrael. Kachamisha Asa Ba'avach Yema Kippurim. It's the Yom Tiv of the renewal of the connection between Yidden and the Meibishter. And that's why the Mishnah finishes, right? Te'eno Arena B'nei Tzion. So here I go, stealing a whole good shir to talk about something which is not le'inyanenu, but it's such good stuff. Right, you almost says an ayem yem. Te'eno Arena B'nei Tzion, so the Alter Rebbe. That the Alter Rebbe overheard his Rebbetzin, his wife, was talking to her friends. And she said, meine Zogt, my husband says. So the Alter Rebbe said, mit ein mitzvah bin ich deine. Mit mitzvahs wieviel bin ich dem Eibishter. I belong to you with only one mitzvah. I belong to the Eibishter with how many mitzvahs? And then he fell on a plitelke, pliretke, I pronounce it, a couch or a sofa, and he was verdweket. Alter Rebbe went into Dvekes. And when he came out of his Dvekes, he said, Se'enu arena b'nei Tzion. The b'nei Tzion went on his wife. And b'nei Tzion, they allow you to go out of yourself, or and see getlichkeit. Go out of yourself, or and see a lakus through b'nei Tzion. And that's how the Mishnah ends. The Mishnah starts off talking about shidduchim, a chosan and a kala, and the real chosan and kala is the Eibishter and Knesset Yisrael, the collective Jew, all of us as one mitzvah. And se'enu arena b'nei Tzion, tayochel, the Eibishter goes out of himself. And he sees a higher inyan because of the asayridus that he gets from Bnei Tzion, from the Jewish people. Ba'melech shleime goes on the Eibishter. Ha'melech sha'asholem shalem. Ba'atara sha'atra le'imei, because of the crown that he gets from his mother. Who is the Eibishter's mother? Also Knesset Yisrael, like it says in the Medrash. Biti yachoisi imi, the Eibishter's daughter, the Eibishter's sister, the Eibishter's mother. So Batzena Arena Bnei Tzion Kveyachal Alakus goes out of itself because of the asayridus that comes from Bnei Tzion. Ba'melech shleimei, ba'atara, with the koyach of the crown that he also got from Knesset Yisrael, but on a much higher madrega. We're Knesset Yisrael, we're in a madrega of imay. And the Mishnah finishes, the pasuk finishes, b'yem chasna nasa, b'yem simchas liba. Yem chasna nasa means a formal marriage, kiddush. B'yem simchas liba means a final, a chuppah, intimacy, together, yichud. And this is sheibana beis hamikdash b'meidav minu omet. So the Masechta finishes. In other words, not just our Yidden special in their connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like it says in Tanya Perek Mavav and Perek Mem Zayin, Asher Kedeshonu b'mitzveisav, that through mitzvahs, Asala Kula Alma Kehektish, through mitzvahs, we belong to the Eibishter, right? They can say it by the chuppahs. They say it at the wrong time. When they call up the two Eidim, they say to the exclusion of all others. When the Chosan says Harei Atma Kodeshes Li, that's when they should say to the exclusion of all others, because that's when it really matters. A Chosan is Makadesh Isha to the exclusion of all others. To the exclusion, that's it. And the Eibishter relationship with the Jewish people is to the exclusion of all others. So the Rebbe says in Tanya, the Eibishter gave us this Kedushin through mitzvahs. But Kedushin is only Eidus. The Chazal say, they're married, but they're not living together. They don't experience the relationship between the Chasna and the Kal. Loss of love is going to be Nisui. In other words, we're going to live together with Nebish, and we'll experience a Yid will experience Gili Elokus, will experience a oneness with Elokus, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's what the Mishnah B'em Chasan Nasa, B'em Simchas Li, B'shibana B'es Hamikdash Mered Min U'amen. Now, okay, so I did more than a Vart and Chamish Asa of. Let us do Igros Kodesh, and we're holding on page Tov Pei Zayin someplace. Last week we did a letter and a half. We did the letter of Tov Pei Vav. We started reading the letter to Harav Zevin. Now, the part of the letter that we read was about, first of all, the Rebbe's involvement, not Rebbe, Harav Zevin's involvement in Yonim of Chabad. Harav Zevin was a Gadol B'Yisrael. Harav Zevin was a real Gadol B'Yisrael. And the truth is he was a Lubavitcher Chassid. It's not just, everybody likes a winner. He was Be'emes a Lubavitcher Chassid. He was the Rebbe Chassid in his way. But he was a Chassid. He was dedicated to the Rebbe. He listened to the Rebbe. He fought for the Rebbe's causes. He defended the Rebbe's honor with great passion, with great shturim, with great tumult. The Harav Zevin. And the Rebbe wanted him involved in Lubavitch. The Rebbe wanted him involved. Zevin was a Weltmensch. He wasn't Chabad. The Rebbe wanted him to be involved in the Rebbe Aguch, and the Rebbe is protesting that he sees a diminution of his involvement. And the second thing was the Rebbe writes him about the Sefer Tzemach Tzedek and the Sefer Stei Chemed. And if you were here last week, when we learned this part of the Igros HaKodesh, I explained to you how difficult it was to get the money to print these for them, and the great Mesiras Nefesh that the Frierdiker Rebbe had to publish the Stei Chemed, to publish the Tzemach Tzedek. The Rebbe didn't print it because of firme, because of politics, because he wanted to make Lubavitch great. The Rebbe printed it because he felt that there was a shortage of Sfarim. The Rabbonim needed halacha Sfarim. Rabbonim in America and in other parts of the world, because of all the tzaras, there was a shortage of Sfarim of halacha. And the Rebbe Rayatz printed the Stei Chemed and Tzemach Tzedek for that Rabbonim should get a copy. And if they have a shailin halacha that's very difficult for them to be mavadir, they should have Sfarim. The Stei Chemed is an encyclopedia of halacha. They should be able to mavadir dinim and paskin halachas asukish maitas aliba de hilchas. Now we read the bottom of page Tov Pei Zayin. Mitztayir ani me'od, I have great pain. Mi pirud halavaves ben hamafleges hacharedi esperetz hakedish tibone v'sekein. That amongst the front parties in Eretz Yisrael, there's so much politics, so much division. V'ha'ikir, and most importantly, b'meshekama mehem, a number of these parties, mevakrim es haravochim shel hamaflega, they prioritize the successes of their limited party, al cheshbon ha'hefsid v'ha'hezek, on the account of the damage and the loss, shel hayahadus hacharedis biklolus, of frum Yiddishkeit as a whole, v'chulu. You're there in Israel. To elaborate is redundant. You know what's going on, and the Rebbe is protesting it. I mean, Bechlau, Jews have a hard time getting along. Frum Jews have a harder time getting along, and the frummer they are, the harder the time they have getting along. Why? I guess on some level it's because they're political people by nature. They're competitive people. They're argumentative people. My grandfather, Olav Shalom, used to say that Shalom is the greatest thing. And the proof is from the Yetzer Hara and the Satan. There is nothing that he invests more in than in breaking Shalom, in creating machlekes. The fact that he invests all of his keiches into creating divisions in Yidden is how great, as Chazal say, Godol HaShalom, how great Shalom is. And in a psychological level, the reason is because the frummer you are, the more principled you are. And when you stand for principle, it's hard for you to balance out not being mevated on your principle and not getting involved in machlekes. If you don't stand for anything, if everything is good, they say in the culture, holocaust, whatever you do is good, it's fun, life is a party. You get along with everybody. Why? If you don't stand for anything, there's nobody you have any problems with. Except people who stand for something. But if you stand for something, and the more you stand for, the more principled you are, especially when you're living in a world which is so against you. And you have to work so hard to be shemed, to be mechazik, what's the lashon? To be mechazik, the choymes hadas. I'm missing a word that's used in this context. To preserve the barrier, the wall that separates inside from outside. So you become a warrior. You become a very intense and aggressive person, and it spills over to the opposite of shalom. It spills over into the yin of machlekes. But machlekes is very costly. Machlekes is a war that people think they can afford to lose. The Rebbe once told people by the Machane Yisrael Development Fund, everybody loses a machlekes. It's only a question of who loses more. When two nations go to war, who wins? Nobody wins. One loses more than the other. One loses less than the other. So one is able to take from the other more than the other from them. But in a war, the minute you shoot the first bullet is loss. On both sides. And yet, people have a very hard time figuring out how to be principled and not be combative. Like the famous idea that the Rebbe brings in his Siches about Talmid Rabbi Akiva. The Talmidei Rabbi Akiva kochzach and the Torah of their Rebbe. What is the most famous and the most important Torahs of their Rebbe Rabbi Akiva? V'yahavta lecha kamecha zeh klal gadol b'Torah. And they argued about that. And they argued about that ad kadei kach that it resulted in lei nagu kavod zeh b'zeh. In order to translate, to interpret what v'yahavta lecha kamecha means, zeh klal gadol b'Torah, they disagreed in its meaning, and there's a lack of respect for one another. And then the Gemara says, happened to them. Why? Because they were so principled about v'yahavta lecha kamecha, they couldn't do it. And this is an incredible test. It's an unbelievable test. When we win this test, Mashiach is not coming. He's here. It's an incredible, incredible test. Then, in the early state of Israel, where the government itself was fighting a war against Kedusha and Tara in an unbelievable way, and you had to be Eimed Allah Mishmor, to guard Chemes Hadas, the Frum parties were all trying to preserve their self-identity, and in their minds, their refusal to join with other parties was because those other parties were not Frum enough. The Rebbe's argument was that you have to think about the greater good. And the greater good is how Frum parties can join together to strengthen the collective cause of Frum Yidden living in Eretz Yisrael. And more broadly, how Frum parties can join together to affect an improvement in the collective cause of life in Eretz Yisrael, even among so-called non-Frum people, including and especially when it came to the area of education and schools, that the children should learn about the Eibishter. And it bothered the Rebbe to no end. And the Rebbe went on a war for many, many, many years to try and find a way of getting the Frum parties to work together, first of all for their own betterment, own benefit, and more importantly for the betterment and the benefit of all the Jewish people. Now, when you read these letters, and these letters don't start in 1951, they start in 1948 and 49, you see what it means that a Rebbe takes a stand. You know? The Frum world was anti-Zionist. I don't have to tell you, right? The Haredi world was anti-Zionist, terribly anti-Zionist, and they were represented by one organization. It was called Agudas Yisrael. Right? Agudas Yisrael, and what's the other name? Eida HaCharedis. There was one and the same thing. In the 1940s, when the possibility of Israel announcing its independence and creating what's called a state and all of these things, these two groups began to tear apart. What had been a unified bloc became a divided bloc. Half of them felt that you have to fight the establishment of the state of Israel at all costs and not join in the efforts of that independence and celebrate independence and benefiting from the state. And this became the Eida Charedis, what we call the Satmar branch of Haredi Judaism. And then was Aguda and others that they felt that now you have to sort of get involved with the government, and they were at war, gefährlich. They were at war with each other. Lubavitch, everybody hated because they walked between the raindrops. They weren't good for this one, they weren't good for this one, they weren't good for this one. But on every practical question, the Rabbeim took a clear position. One of the positions that Rabbeim took a strong position on was, you must vote. In Israel, you must vote. Chas v'sholom, one Frum vote should go to waste, because if you don't vote, you don't have any power, and Frum Yidden have to assert their power. The Rebbe didn't see it as a way of only maintaining and sustaining and supporting Frum causes. The Rebbe saw it as an incorporating of Frum people into the general population of Eretz Yisrael to influence the direction of the whole country. That there should be Eibishter, there should be Moshe Rabbeinu, and Avraham Avinu, and Teira men Hashemayim, and Teira shebeksav, and Teira shebal peh, and Kiyam mitzvahs. This was the Rebbe's issue. Number two, Chabad itself does not belong to a political party. Because the Rebbe holds Rabbi Alocha belonging to a political party in Yisrael goes into halachic questions. To join a secular state as an official political party means that you're a party member to all the decisions that the states make that are against the halacha. But on the other hand, the Rebbe said you should vote. So Chabad does not join a political party, and the Rebbe's position is vote for the Frumist party in Eretz Yisrael. But this has become, in the last 25 years, a big question, even amongst the Rabbanei Anash, because what's the Frumist party? I mean, always we voted for Aguda. Aguda is the Frumist party. But when it comes to the question of Shleimus Haaretz, land for peace, They were not the strongest, and they may still not be the strongest. So there's a segment within Chabad says that the frumest party is the party that's considered Shleimus Haaretz, and this is created in Lubavitch, another area of Machlokes. And the argument is, one side is saying the fact is as good as the frumest party, and the other side is saying Pikuach Nefesh Teicha Kol HaTeira Kula. So the party that's fighting for Pikuach Nefesh is by default the frumest party. Even when it comes to other mitzvahs, they're less intense. And this is another area of Machlokes, that Lubavitch should vote for the frumest party. And finally, and that's really the neshama of these few lines here, you can see that there's dots, there's a lot taken out of this letter, is that the Rebbe strongly supported the idea of a chazit datit meuchadet, a block. That the frum party should form a block. They should run as a block, they should vote as a block, and they should act as a block. So you had Aguda, you had maybe a little while something called Payali Aguda, you had Mapai, Pagi, whatever it was called, Payali Aguda Yisrael, you had Mizrahi, and of course much later on you had the Sfadi party. The Rebbe wanted frum parties to function as a unit, and again he felt and he feels that it's much better for the Jewish people, for frum people, Befrat, and more importantly, or also importantly, that it's better for all of Klal Yisrael, B'chol Mokem Shehem. And they didn't listen. The Rebbe begged and pleaded, and he wrote hundreds of letters over the course of many years. In the 60s, in the mid-60s, I think it happened once, the Rebbe was pushing very strong that frum parties would function as a block. And in the Rebbe's words in this letter, don't think only about what is the benefit of your party. Think what's the benefit of frum Yiddishkeit, Befrat, and how frum Yiddishkeit can affect all of it, Yisrael as a kal. Now it's 70 years since these letters were written. You imagine that people look back and say, maybe the Lubavitcher Rebbe was right. Sometimes they see it after 10 years, sometimes they see it after 20 years, and sometimes it takes 100 years to see the vision of the Rebbe. But the Rebbe fought. The Rebbe pushed very hard that there should be a chazid datit meuchadet. So in this letter, in the part that's printed here, he speaks not only to the question of a unified block, but to the pidat halavavis, the lack of cooperation and the jealousy and the politics. It's hard, not to be selfish when you're living in such difficult times. But that's what the expectation is. Okay, so we're going to read on, if we may. Okay, very bottom of page Tov Pezai. Samachti lahayadiya b'mechtave. I was delighted to hear in your letter. There's more copies right there. There's more copies. Asher akrach hashlishi shel ha'encyclopedia kvar nimtze b'kricha. That the third volume of the Talmudic encyclopedia, halachic encyclopedia, is already being bound. Ve'evid tvei teirasei achshav ala krach haravia, and you're currently working on the fourth volume. The Jewish people spiritually have fallen staggeringly in an indescribable way since the Holocaust. I'm not talking about the fact that some people are not frum. I'm talking about even the frum world. But there are certain things that in the frum world have happened that exceed anything that's happened for a very long time, maybe hundreds of years. And one of those things is Sfarim. The incredible radiation of manuscripts being printed for the first time, and old Sfarim being renewed, and then what we call modern Sfarim with a modern approach, which is really a modern day creation, is unbelievable. It's pashut unbelievable. And there are literally hundreds of Sfarim that are written in the post-Holocaust world by frum Yidden that are not just more of the same, Chidushim and Beyurim, but they make halacha, they make Torah, they make halacha much more practical, much more available, much more actionable. One of the most important efforts in this area is the Talmudic Encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Talmudis, which started 80 years ago. It was started by Meir Berlin Bar-Ilan. And he was an elderly man, he was a big god, the son of the Nitziv. I think it was the son of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. And he started the project, and he hired Gedolim and Rashi Yeshivas B'nai Torah to work with him. And the Oirech Rashi from the beginning was Harav Zevin. And he served in this role for the rest of his life, till he passed away in 1978, in Tafshan Lamed Ches. And the Rebbe wrote him in many letters that Hazor Tfei Shalei, who Aveda Ben Encyclopedia, the Rebbe said to him, your shlichus, is to work on the encyclopedia. The Rebbe saw the Encyclopedia Talmudis as an incredibly important work, because it's not just a work of Torah, it's a work of halacha. The Encyclopedia Talmudis, it's Talmud. Talmud means Gemara, but Lenyani halacha, and it's in alphabetical order, and every halacha, every area in Torah is. They go back to the Psukim and to the Mishnah and to the Gemara and to the Rishgoinim and to the Rishonim and to the Achreinim until the Poskim. It's very comprehensive. Everything, of course, is sourced. And it's some of the greatest minds in the Jewish world today have dedicated their lives to the encyclopedia. And the Rebbe delighted in the encyclopedia. I mean, there's a letter from the Rebbe when the 17th Krach, I think 17th Krach, of Encyclopedia Talmudis came out. This was in the 1980s. It's interesting that it took 40 years to produce, more than 40 years to produce 17 Krachim. They're holding now, like by 45 or 46, they're working much faster. And I think the reason why they're working much faster is not just because they figured out the technique, is they have pushed a larger staff. There's a lot of people today, more people today than there was 60 years ago, who are b'nei Torah and the Madrege, where they could work on such an effort. And it's a very, very important work. When the Rebbe got the 17th Krach of Encyclopedia, or the 16th Krach, he wrote a letter to a Yid whose name was Harav Yitzchok Hutner. He was the Eirech Rashi, he was the manager. He wasn't the Eirech Rashi, he was Harav Zevin of the Encyclopedia Talmudis. That the 17th Krach arrived. By the way, in the beginning, there's a dedication to the Rebbe. It's dedicated to our Rebbe. And the Rebbe writes about it, Nismala Habayis Kula Eire. Like the Chazal say, when Moshe Rabbeinu was born, the room was filled with light. The Rebbe said, I received volume 16 or 17, I think it's 17, but I'm not sure, of the encyclopedia, it's the mid-80s. And the room was filled with light. That's how strongly the Rebbe felt about the uselessness of the encyclopedia. And we know that people who worked with the Rebbe in publishing would get very strong responses. The Rebbe spoke a sicha, and they had certain questions, and the Rebbe sent out a note. Did any of you think to look in the Encyclopedia Talmudis? Then the Encyclopedia Talmudis went only till Ches or Tes. Now they're holding Mem. In alphabetical order. They went from Aleph, they're holding Mem. It's an incredible piece of work. It's a project that's 80 years in the making, and it's still in the midst of its development. They're working hard on it, I'm imagining. And the Rebbe is acknowledging this effort in 1951, when they had printed volume 3. And the Rebbe says, bravo, let's read. Turn to page Tov Peches. Hayisi nehene. How happy would I be? If I had in my library all the volumes of encyclopedia, they have incredible value. To everybody's about the Abish's holy Torah. And the Rebbe wasn't going to pay for Sfarim. I've told this to you many times. 3 books, that's all it was. 3. It would be nice if I had a copy. It would have been nice. That's the Rebbe way of saying, please send me one. What's the word in English? Gratis, on the house. The Rebbe would not pay for Sfarim. He wouldn't pay for Sfarim. He would trade. He would send you Sfarim from Americas for your Sfarim, but he wouldn't pay for Sfarim. The Friedrich Rebbe, the Rebbe said, the Friedrich Rebbe used to give away money that he needed for medicine and for food to buy Sfarim. It's one of the big and obvious differences between the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe. Now, you could make a case that this difference is not just a reflection of the personalities of the two Rebbes, but it's a reflection of the times in which they lived. The Friedrich Rebbe was buying Sfarim in the 30s, before the war. But the Rebbe wouldn't pay for Sfarim. But the Rebbe always asked that Mechabrim should consider it an honor to them that their Sefer is in the Rebbe's library. And of course, the Rebbe's library is incredibly large. I don't know what number of volumes they have. It's in the hundreds of thousands of Sfarim. And Mechabrim today, if they have Seichel, you print a Sefer, you send a copy to the Rebbe. You don't need, the greatest honor is that the Rebbe takes it from you. Somebody pointed this out to me. I didn't notice this. But when people came to the Rebbe with Sfarim, the Rebbe would say, for a Sefer Daf Min Tzolim, for a Sefer, you have to give him an extra $1. Evidently, the Rebbe didn't say it to everybody and didn't give it to everybody. Sometimes people gave Sfarim, the Rebbe just took it. Sometimes the Rebbe took a Sefer and he gave $1. In other words, it was Yesh Sfarim, the Rebbe took them all, but Yesh Sfarim, Yesh Sfarim. But Yaman Klein told me, because my uncle, through marriage, told me that the Rebbe had a Sfarim obsession. Push it. The Rebbe was obsessed over Sfarim like a child with candy. If you brought in a new Sefer to the Rebbe, whatever he was doing, he stopped, and he would look through the Sefer page by page. But he would look through the sefer like he was looking at comics. But he saw every word. He would read it. Like a photographic, you take a picture of the page. That's how the Rebbe's brain worked. And he would look through every sefer. And there's a story, I think I heard it from Binyamin, but if I didn't hear it from Binyamin, I heard it from somebody else, that somebody brought in a sefer to the Rebbe 10 minutes after 3. 10 minutes after 3. A sefer of halacha. And he asked Rabbi Klein to bring it into the Rebbe. Rabbi Klein said, if I bring it into the Rebbe now, Mincha is going to be delayed, because the Rebbe is going to stop what he's doing, he's going to look through your sefer. And the Yid begged and pleaded, I want the Rebbe to see my sefer before Mincha, because he wanted the Rebbe to know that he came with a sefer, and to hear the Rebbe's comment. So Rabbi Klein reluctantly brought it into the Rebbe. Mincha was 25 after 3. It was a 400-page sefer. The Rebbe leafed through every page. Just leafed every page. But he read the whole book in 15 minutes, what takes you 100 years, took the Rebbe 5 seconds. Anyway, he was outside. The Rebbe walked out to Mincha. On the way back from Mincha, the Rebbe acknowledged him. And he said to the Rebbe, I brought the Rebbe a sefer, and the Rebbe acknowledged that. He says, "Nu, what does the Rebbe have to say about my sefer?" It was the Rebbe's room, 15 minutes. And the Rebbe said, you make a sefer of halacha, and not once do you mention the Alter Rebbe. Now, you should know, to say that it says the Alter Rebbe in a sefer is genius. To say that it doesn't say the Alter Rebbe in a sefer is a double genius. Maybe you missed a line. You print the sefer of halacha, and you bring it to me. And you want to hear my askoma bracha, what I have to say about it. Not once. But Sfarim by the Rebbe were so tired, so precious. But he wouldn't pay for a sefer. The Rebbe had money only for a fatzah. The Rebbe even held off from printing Maimori Chasidus for decades, for lack of resources. The Rebbe's priority, the Rebbe's principle, the Rebbe's ikir and tofel, that you have to save Yiddish and Neshamas first, before you print Sfarim, whatever it is, was so clearly defined. It was so absolute. So he writes, Rabbi Zevin, it would be nice. I'm sure Rabbi Zevin the next day had a shipment sent out, however, whether it was flown or it was shipped, that the Rebbe should have his encyclopedia. But it's interesting how the Rebbe writes, I'd be happy if your Sfarim were in my library. And of course, there's another story to that. For many, many years, the Rebbe's library was neglected. It didn't really have a place, and you couldn't find a sefer. The Rebbe collected thousands and thousands of Sfarim. They were in storehouses, and they rented a house. They stored them in a house. You couldn't find a sefer. Harav Bet Levin Zolgazunzain became the Rebbe's librarian in the early 1970s. Within a year of him taking over the library, every single sefer was cataloged and shelved. And there's a story once that the Rebbe, someone had given the Rebbe a gift, a siddur, a precious siddur. And when he visited the Rebbe in Yechidus, the Rebbe asked if he wants to see it. So he said, yeah. So the Rebbe called in Rabbi Groner and asked Rabbi Groner to get a hold of the sefer. And Rabbi Groner came back and said, I can't find it. A few years later, he came again. And again, the Rebbe asked him if he wanted to see it. And he remembered from the time before that the Rebbe was not able to show it to him. So nah. Anyway, the Rebbe called in Rabbi Groner in 5 minutes. The Rebbe label crawled up Bet 11. In 5 minutes, the sefer was on the Rebbe's table. And for the Rebbe, it was a big nachas. The Rebbe was able to satisfy his ratzon to show a Yid who had given the Rebbe matana, and for that person it was a big svias ratzon, that he should be able to see that the Rebbe has a sefer, and the Rebbe knows where it is, and so forth and so on. Let's finish this letter. And to elaborate this is redundant, not necessary. I haven't gotten a single volume. In other words, nobody thought to send them to me. And the truth of the matter is, it's a grace akasha why Rabbi Zevin didn't. I'm going to venture a guess that Rabbi Zevin sent it to the Friedrich Rebbe, and then ended up in the Friedrich Rebbe's library. And perhaps Rabbi Zevin, he didn't understand that then they were two libraries, that they didn't cross at all. And then, of course, in the 1980s, we had the whole Mishpat HaSfarim, and then the two libraries became one greater library, the library of Agudas Chasidei Chabad. So maybe that's the reason why the Rebbe didn't get a copy, because Harav Zevin sent it to the Friedrich Rebbe's library. Tama b'mechtavi. You're wondering in your letter, there's so many Hasidim still in France who are without homes and without countries and without permanent places. How come they don't move to Eretz Yisrael? Eretz Yisrael was an opportunity for Jews after the Holocaust, a place where they could live and become citizens and have passports and have a little bit of safety after all the tzaddus they went through. And of course, the Gemara says, Bo ben Gurion v'hamid and alachas, right? The whole Tayyag mitzvah is one mitzvah. You don't have to believe in the Eibishter. Aliyah, aliyah, aliyah. And we don't believe that. We don't believe the whole Torah is aliyah. There's tayag mitzvahs. According to somebody showing you, there's a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of living in Eretz Yisrael, and beautifying Eretz Yisrael, and inhabiting Eretz Yisrael, and most importantly, not leaving Eretz Yisrael once you come there. And but it's only one mitzvah. I told you this before. The Harav Gordon visited the Rebbe, Shlomo Gordon. I heard this from one of my teachers, that he asked the Rebbe, does the Lubavitcher Rebbe hold from Aliyah? And the Rebbe answered, ich halt von Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Aliyah is a modern term. Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a halachic term. So we asked the Rebbe a second time, does the Rebbe hold of Aliyah? And the Rebbe answered a second time, ich halt von Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. A few times, the Rebbe wasn't Aliyah. Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So Harav Zevin is asking, and I'm Mistama, people pushed him to ask, every Jew has to live in Israel. I mean, that's, if you ask Zionists what their philosophy is, all the 15, 16 million Jews in the world should come live in Eretz Yisrael, and they see it as not just a religious obligation. They see it as the religious obligation. And the Rebbe does not agree with them, does not, for many reasons. For many, many, many reasons. B'chlal, the Rebbe doesn't believe you leave a yishuv. You don't leave where Jewish people live and they're serving Hashem and they have the opportunity to do so. You don't go. Jews don't run. Mashiach will come, he'll gather us together. But Jews don't run. And more importantly, leaders don't leave. The Rebbe always wrote in his letters, at the last person to abandon a sinking ship is the captain. That's the way it works. And in these communities, often they would mobilize, they would recruit the Rabbonim and the Klei Kodesh, and they would offer them prominent positions in Eretz Yisrael. And it was much more honorable. They were living in Shtatalach. They were big lomdim living in small communities. And the Rebbe said, you can't leave your flock. As long as there's one left, you're the second. And many people listened to the Rebbe, but many, many people, unfortunately, didn't listen to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe writes like this, Ukenida, Shahasibahi, the reason is, that the reason people are now moving to Israel is the letters that they're receiving from their friends who have already moved to Israel and the conditions in the Kfar Chabad. Over the last entire period, only a few actually asked me, when they go to Israel, they are holding by going to Israel. And the Rebbe sort of, in this letter, is agreeing with Rabbi Zevin. More should go. But I want you, there's another letter from the Rebbe. Maybe it's written to Shazar. There's a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe for sure, where he writes, I do not give answers collectively. I don't give answers carte blanche. I don't give an answer for everybody. Every mishpacha has different needs. Every mishpacha has different opportunities, and each one of them asks separately, and each one is answered based on their needs and how they ask. As the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote, and I think this letter from the Rebbe to the same effect. The Rebbe didn't just send us a Yidden Etzol Stam Azay, and he certainly did not invite Yidden to come to America. The Rebbe was not necessarily happy with the Anash who came here. If they see b'sheinus and mishun, in the coming days, I'm going to return to you. Echad Mishnei HaBichlach, one of the two Sfarim of Chassidus that Harav Zevin had lent the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, I'm copying it, I presume, we're learning it, and I'm going to send it back to you. Okay, I'll see it all tomorrow morning. Thank you all for coming, and have a